Hi, my name is Amy Nelson, and I did this final project as part of EDF 787, Technology, Innovation, and Education. For my final project, I really wanted to take a look at one-to-one initiatives, and I wanted to examine them using a critical race theory lens. So let's start with the definition of one-to-one. So when we're defining one-to-one, what that really means is one computerized device per student. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a laptop. It could be an iPad or some other device. But typically those devices for current K-12 one-to-one educational technologies, even though this definition is from 2012, it really does still apply today. And so current K-12 one-to-one educational technologies are devices that are typically wireless. So they're accessible to the internet and at least one local school network. They're most typically equipped with software and support for classroom instruction, such as homework, tests, feedback, presentations, social networking, and productivity applications, such as word processing. Most typically, they're available for use 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And while sometimes students aren't able to take them home, most typically when we're talking about one-to-one initiatives, students are taking those devices home so that they can complete homework and continue with their studies and research. And one-to-one technology is usually compatible with digital tools and resources such as online courses, interactive whiteboards, and probes for data collection and science experiments. So the use of technology, of course, was not new with the introduction of one-to-one in the 1990s. But researchers had been arguing for quite some time that if technology was going to actually make a difference, it had to be incorporated more than once a week in a lab. So one-to-one initiatives were first introduced in Australia and the United States in the 1990s. And Maine was the first state to launch a statewide initiative. So every kid across the state had a device. So this was called the Maine Learning and Technology Initiative. After Maine, the one-to-one initiatives then became increasingly common, spreading to other states and countries. Some of the reasons that one-to-one initiatives became more feasible on a broader scale were the decreasing cost, lighter weight, and the increasing availability of wireless connectivity. Aims of one-to-one initiatives really varied across schools and districts. But one thing that was consistent across one-to-one initiatives was the goal of ubiquitous computer access for all students. Additional aims, although not consistent across all initiatives, some of the aims that were included included improved teaching and learning, increase efficiency, develop important skills, and then there were political leaders that, in supporting one-to-one initiatives, they really were looking for economic prosperity in their regions, improving academic achievement, increasing equity of access to digital resources and the digital divide. And of course, since we'll be examining this through the critical race theory lens, we're going to come back to that topic here pretty soon. And then transforming the quality of instruction, college and career readiness, and of course, 21st century learning skills. So a large number of studies reported positive outcomes in relation to one-to-one initiatives, and I looked at several meta-analyses, and so these outcomes existed across multiple studies. So what you see in that first column there, these findings, or the majority of these findings, were from a meta-analysis by Zing and his team in 2016, and these findings that they've highlighted showed up in 70 of 96 studies, so quite a few. And so some of the outcomes that they found were increased frequency and breadth, increased student-centered, individualized, and project-based learning, increased quantity and genres of writing, increased teacher-student and homeschool relationships, and then they also found that one-to-one initiatives really promoted students' learning autonomy. Some of the other studies and meta-analysis that I looked at, some additional outcomes that showed up were that one-to-one initiatives provided more equitable access to resources, ubiquitous computer access to all students, increased student engagement. Some studies even found decreased disciplinary problems. You see that focus on writing again with increased use of computers for writing, analysis, and research. Some studies found that there was a real distinct movement towards student-centered classrooms. Other studies saw improved individual and collaborative learning skills, as well as enhancing the level of student interest, motivation, and engagement in learning. So, of course, with the rise of one-to-one initiatives, we also saw a rise in criticism of one-to-one initiatives. So there are a number of questions, a number of concerns, and a number of issues regarding one-to-one initiatives in terms of the numerous outcomes that we just went over. And so that whole category of critique is referred to as techno-critique. So not everyone believed that the outcomes that we went over can be linked directly to each student having a laptop or linked directly to each student having a device, right? And so one of the more popular critiques was by Larry Cuban in 2006. And he argued that the outcomes are more likely a result of innovative teaching and individualized problem-based instruction rather than the actual device, right? And so he's arguing that the outcomes are from the improvements in teaching and instruction and not the actual device in and of itself. And then we have Meyer, and he brings up a separate argument. And his argument is that computers, they have positive uses, but there's also newfound negative uses, right? And so because of this makes evaluations of implementation success unpurposed. Okay, so we finally reached critical race theory. As I mentioned earlier, I really want to examine these one-to-one initiatives using a critical race theory lens. And I really like this quote by Lopez because I think it does a great job of capturing what critical race theory really is. So we'll just go ahead and read through that quote. As an outgrowth of the civil rights movement and the critical legal studies movement, critical race theory's premise is to critically interrogate how the law reproduces, reifies, and normalizes racism in society. Rather than subscribe to the belief that racism is an abnormal or unusual concept, critical race theorists begin with the premise that racism is normal and an endemic component of our social fabric. Critical race theory scholars suggest society fails to see racism because racism blends into everyday common experiences. In other words, racism is part of our everyday reality. It is part of our social fabric and embedded in our organizations, practices, and structures. It is the usual way society does business. All right, so from there we can move into the history of critical race theory. So critical race theory evolved in the 1970s, and it evolved as part of the civil rights movement. And the founders there on the screen, Derek Bell, Charles Lawrence, Leni Guinier, Richard Delgado. I'm not going to list all of them. They're there on the screen for you to see. But what's important is that each of those founders, they emphasize how the law reproduces and normalizes racism in society. So you can see in the beginning, critical race theory, the focus was on law. And the emphasis was on how law reproduces and normalizes racism in society, right? And so they were really critiquing the role of law in society and the way it privileged the wealthy and the powerful. All right, so let's jump into the fundamental elements of critical race theory. So the first is that racism is a normalized aspect of American culture. The second element is this idea of interest convergence. And interest convergence was coined by Derek Bell, a law professor and one of the founders of critical race theory. And what he meant by interest convergence is this notion, or fact really, that Black people achieved their civil rights victories only when white and Black interests converge. Okay? The third fundamental element is giving voice to people of color. And the last is the eradication of injustice by eliminating all forms of oppression. Right? We, of course, cannot talk about critical race theory without talking about Freire. So Freire had this notion of critical practice, this idea that he introduced. And I really like this description by Duncan Andre and Morel. Right, so you see that quote on the screen. we'll just read that together. So critical practice involves continued action for social justice, but it also involves continued reflection on the actions necessary to deal effectively with the problems that have been identified. All right, so Freire's concept of critical practice, it really involves 5 stages, right? And these 5 stages are cyclical, right? So we're going to go through the stages and then come back up and go through them again. So stage 1 is identify a problem. Stage 2, analyze the problem. Stage 3, create a plan of action to address the problem. Step 4, implement the plan of action. And step 5, analyze and evaluate the action, right? And when we talk about how CRT applies to one-to-one, we're really going to look at how we can involve critical practice in our decision making. All right, so with that, let's jump into critical race theory and one-to-one initiatives. So if we're using critical race theory to examine one-to-one initiatives, then we can start by looking at the aims, right? And so the aims of most, if not all, one-to-one initiatives included ubiquitous computer access, right? And so if we're thinking of all ubiquitous, why wouldn't equity of access also be mentioned uniformly across all studies? So if we're using critical race theory as a lens, we really can't assume that ubiquitous includes all, right? Because CRT scholars suggest that racism blends into our everyday realities. And so critical race theory challenges us to rethink traditional educational systems and policies and expose challenges and obstacles faced by students of color, right? And when we think of this, we're also thinking about that intersection of race and socioeconomic status. And when critical race theory was included in education, scholars were challenged to call attention to race-related power and pay attention to policies that marginalize students of color. And so we have to think about that, how that applies to one-to-one initiatives, right? And so despite an increase in the number of one-to-one initiatives, the digital divide still exists, and that's a problem. Students from low-income households continue to face seemingly insurmountable challenges to full digital access. So this quote is from a 2015 newspaper article that was featured in the Atlantic, and I found it really interesting. The district was trying to get creative around the number of snow days they were having in the region. And their idea was using technology, using iPads, in order for kids to access their education from home. And while this was a good idea, it just wasn't feasible for all students. And so they struggled with equity because not all students had access to computers outside of school. And even when they tried to increase the number of devices students were able to access, they weren't able to make sure that all students could access the internet, so to connect from home, right? And so this quote from that article, we have constructed an education system dependent on local property taxes that provides great schools for the rich kids in the suburbs who need the least help, and broken, dangerous schools for inner city children who desperately need a helping hand. Too often, America's education system amplifies not opportunity, but inequality. And so, of course, in being in the middle of school closures, we definitely have to look at COVID-19 distance learning and one-to-one. And what we're finding, or what's being found, is that the absence rate appears particularly high in schools with many low-income students whose access to home computers and internet connections can be spotty. So access to education, period, not just education after school, but education at all, is an issue, right? And so we're learning that schools that aren't able to implement one-to-one are really at a disadvantage. So I appreciate this quote by Janelle Scott, a UC Berkeley professor. And she says, this crisis has laid bare what we always knew, how equitable opportunities are so dependent on parental background and wealth and access to resources. Now, although we assume positive intent, all right, so as with any reform, the aims of one-to-one initiatives are not always met. Of course, this doesn't mean that the reform has failed and that positive outcomes are not feasible. But if we're going to reach those positive outcomes, reflection and evaluation have to take place so we can identify problems and implement new plans of action. This process has to continue until one-to-one initiatives reach the desired aim of equitable outcomes for all students.